of the History Department, and I'd like to welcome you to this week's Humanities Forum. As we begin, I'd like to thank supporters of the Humanities Forum, including the Development of Western Civ program, the Provost's Office, and a longtime supporter of our history programming, the Gladys Brooks Foundation. I also want to thank you guys for coming. Come on in, take a seat. It's a beautiful day to come hear about Frederick Douglass and the women in his world. I just want to let you guys know the talk is going to be about a 50-minute talk. And then afterwards, we'll have a question and answer session. When we do the question and answer session, we'll have 2 sets of mics. So when we do that, just raise your hand and we'll have the discussion, but do wait for the microphone so it can be taped. And then afterwards, and I've told my students this, there's a reception in the Great Hall. And it's really one of the most important parts of the process here, is not just to hear stuff and to take it down and write it in your computers, but to think about it and talk about it. And so I encourage you guys to come in. The food is better than what you'll find. Maybe that's a low bar, but we should be good on that. But do come to the reception. It's an important part of this process. With that, I'd like to welcome, and I do want to make one more announcement. This is a Frederick Douglass programming because of a faculty and student reading group on Frederick Douglass. We will have one more Frederick Douglass program coming, which will be 7 days after Thanksgiving, the Thursday after Thanksgiving. David Blight is going to come, and David Blight is the biggest name in Frederick Douglass studies, and a friend of Leigh's. So it'll be great to have him here, so I do encourage you, if you can, to come to that one. With that, I do want to welcome our guest, the historian and my friend, Leigh Fought, who comes to us from Moyne College, where she has taught since 2012. She has worked on the topics at the intersection of slavery and gender, including a book that I need to read and haven't, Southern Womanhood and Slavery, the life of Louisa McCord, who is one crazy woman. And if you've read Louisa McCord, you'll know what I'm talking about. Professor Fought is working on a new book due next year. Okay, due in 2 years from Routledge on Sally Hemings, a biography of Sally Hemings. So I see some heads nodding already. Yes, I want to read that, or I want to assign that to classes. But that's one we're definitely looking forward to. But today, she's not going to talk about those projects. She's going to be talking about another project she did. Her 2017 Oxford University Press, Women in the World of Frederick Douglass. This is a prize-winning book, winning the Herbert Lehman Prize from the New York History Academy, the Mary Kelly Prize from SHEAR, the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic, and she was even a finalist in the Harriet Tubman Prize from the Lapidamus Center at Schomburg at New York Public Library. This is an impressive book and an important work, talking about not just Frederick Douglass. How many of you, just curious, how many of you have read Frederick Douglass in a Civ or elsewhere? Okay. So most of you, the vast majority, have read some Frederick Douglass. And to think deeply and hard about the way his life is affected by and affects the women in his world. And it's a great book and an important topic. It's a special honor and privilege to introduce Professor Fought today. Our history goes back to 2009 when we were at a NEH program together at Johns Hopkins University. We were both working on our own separate books, but thinking about it together. So with that, it is a special honor and privilege to introduce Professor Fought to talk about what she created after that process. So with no more ado, Professor Fought.
Jazz hands. No. Sorry, I get a little nervous, so I get extra silly. So thank you so much, Patrick. That was a very generous introduction. And I'm really so happy to know that so many of you are actually familiar with Frederick Douglass. That is not always the case, and it makes me sad because everybody should know about Frederick Douglass. He is probably one of the most important men in the history of our country, as are the women in his life. I normally would start out thanking everybody, but Patrick did such a great job of that. I think it's really important to stay for forums like that. I mean, I kind of want to go home and tell the Jesuits at Lemoyne that the Dominicans here are kicking their butts when it comes to the humanities, because really the humanities, the social sciences, the liberal arts, we are the battleground, we are the casualties, and we are the medics in cultural wars. And so places like this, forums like this, really show how important the deep, engaged study and contemplation of the human condition, of the human, whatever it is we are and doing in this world, is so incredibly important to your education, what you're here in college for, and to running a civilization in the broadest sense of the world, society. So thank you for that. And I want to thank all of you again for being here. I know there's a lot of competition for your time, especially at this point in the semester. If I weren't on family leave at the moment, I probably would be grading a lot of papers myself, or as you all are writing them on the other end of it. And so if you're here for extra credit, I don't care. You're here. If you're multitasking, I don't care. You're here. You chose to be here, and I thank you very much for that, and I hope to make it worth your while. Now, well, let's see. When most people come to give papers like this, they generally talk about a work in progress or a completed work, like Women in the World of Frederick Douglass, available in hardback and paperback and Kindle. I have a couple of copies if you want to buy one afterward. Just saying. And, you know, audiences, well, when you go see a band, you do expect them to play their greatest hits. Any reference I would make, you young folks would not understand. But some of you, if you go see Billy Joel, you expect him to play Piano Man. Okay, I'm waiting to hear the gray hairs laugh at that one. Okay, but what I'm going to do today is do something counterintuitive. I'm going to present to you a paper that I subtitle the book I did not write. What I want to do is engage with you, of course, the subject of Frederick Douglass and women. I mean, you will not leave here disappointed, and I know I'll leave something out. In fact, I'll leave a lot out. That's kind of the point of this paper, what got left out. Please ask me about Anna Douglass. Ask me about Helen Douglass. Ask me about Rosetta Douglass Sprague. Ask me about Julia Griffiths or Adelia Asing or whatever. Ask David Blight about Adelia Asing and his opinion vis-a-vis my opinion when he visits next time. We have lots of discussions about that. But what I want to do is tell you about Douglass and women, and also in the process kind of show you what happens when you sit down to write history. Okay? Because that's kind of what doing the humanities is, making choices, and when you make one choice, you sometimes have to give up others. Okay? But presuming that most of you, probably all of you, have not read Women in the World of Frederick Douglass, available on Amazon, hardback, paperback, Kindle, or, you know, cut rate afterwards, see me, in my bag. Okay, it's not funny the second time around, is it? Okay, so I get nervous, I tell bad jokes, I'm not that funny. Okay, what I will do is summarize a little bit of Women in the World of Frederick Douglass. What the book I did write, Women in the World of Frederick Douglass, it tells the story of the ways that women created Frederick Douglass. That is both the man himself, the person, and the phenomena, this image, this celebrity, Frederick Douglass. The ways that they taught him to survive slavery, how they helped him to liberate himself, how they engaged in partnerships against racism, how they spurred his intellectual development, how they ensured his economic well-being, and how, a lesser-known story, but I put in a chapter, and I think it's incredibly important, how they preserved his legacy, all the way up to today, including me standing here. From this story emerges an outline of Frederick Douglass via the negative space, that is, the negative feminine space around him. Now, recreating this space required rethinking the roles of women in the lives of the great men. Now, I know you've probably heard the cliche, behind every great man is an equally great woman. And you've probably also heard the joke that she's very, very surprised. That really tells you nothing about the man, the woman, or the alchemy produced by their interactions. So in rethinking Douglass and women, such things as the configuration of a black man and a white woman peering together in the civic sphere as equals had to be rescued from prurience and given political significance, as did the importance of domesticity, domestic labor, and privacy, even the doctrine of separate spheres, which is like nails on the chalkboard to most women historians today, that had to be resurrected as a tool with cultural significance to an African-American couple fleeing slavery and moving into a racist North. Furthermore, the motives of each individual woman as actors with their own agendas, their own backgrounds, and contexts of their own had to be uncovered if their relationship with Douglass, his life, and his work were going to make any sense whatsoever. However, to do this, I found that I had to research Douglass's life from the ground up, that in fact the secondary literature proved very useless to me after a while. As I was going through, I even stopped citing what the secondary literature was saying because it wasn't saying anything. My methods, and understand this as separate from politics, my methods became more and more conservative, as in careful, old-fashioned, grounded in documents, as I wanted to recreate human interactions that more often than I was constructing arguments informed by theory. This shaped the book that I did write, which emphasizes women who worked and lived closely with Douglass and who could be traced somehow or other through the archives in writing. So that, again, makes it rather a conservative sort of an approach. I felt that this was absolutely necessary because much had been written about women, especially women in the abolitionist movement and in the women's rights movement, and much had been written about Douglass. But the two never really intersected in a satisfying manner. In fact, the scholarship of each tended to rely on the other, creating kind of an unintended syllogism that never quite explained itself, nor proved itself. And in the case of the women who lived closest to him, in his family circle, in his house, way more was assumed than actually documented, proven, or even researched. Therefore, I had to rebuild Douglass's biography from the documents with a fresh eye, which often meant a woman's eye, or an eye for women. This also meant compiling as much evidence as I possibly could. Here I will show you the extent of my footnotes. I wish more people would read them because I think they are things of beauty. I've got like 65 pages of endnotes. I show my work, just saying. I didn't do that so much in math because I didn't do a whole lot of work in math, but that's another story. Okay, so where was I? Okay, so anyway, I compiled as much evidence as I could, especially when going against information that was generally considered consensus or in making informed judgments. Informed judgments, which are usually, disparaged as speculation. If I was speculating, I had tons of information on which I was basing it. I wanted this book to honor the choices faced by the women in Douglass's life and the decisions made by those women and by Douglass, and I wanted this book to stand as a work of honest, solid scholarship that could serve as a useful foundation for others. Again, all the footnotes. You can follow my work if you want to. Now, in making the choice to tell the story this way, other choices fell by the wayside. Okay. Some of those that fell by the wayside are the ones that I want to discuss today. Okay. The first one is, this is not an encyclopedia of women in the world of Frederick Douglass. Do you know how many people were upset that it wasn't, and how many people complained? You didn't talk about this one person who he met this one day for 3 hours, and it would be actually a worthy endeavor, an encyclopedia, but that's not what this book was about. Okay. But that was the merest of choices. I mean, that's a logical choice. The biggest choice was this. The book I did write was a women's history. That is, a history about women and the things that they did in the life of Frederick Douglass. Okay, so I'm coming at it from that point of view. I'm approaching Douglass from women's history. So, the book I did not write was a gender history. Gender's in there, but it is not a history of gender, or as when I found a new tool, it was great. The philosophers Omi and Winott would say those women's performances of their gender, or the way that they did their gender, in tandem with the way Douglass performed or did his. I didn't engage a lot of dissecting of the types of gender, et cetera, at the time. Now, Douglass on manhood, it writes itself, and in fact, most of the work on Douglass and gender tends to focus on masculinity. I mean, it's right there. Look at the pictures of him. This is a man presenting black manhood, and it's beautiful. Okay. He and his black male cohort staked their demand on citizenship, not only on their own performance of manhood, but their depiction as men who were superior to the men who deigned to say they owned him. True men prove themselves through physicality, which included self and community defense, hence the militance in his rhetoric. It included sexual restraint. Okay. That's very, very important to understand when looking at Douglass and women. And it included civic morality, which meant self-reliance, intellectual development, and community leadership, often which was either covered up the work of women or was done in tandem with the work of women. And you see these hallmarks throughout Douglass's autobiographies and biographies. Early in his life, he sees his manhood from the dehumanization of slavery, transforming himself, in his words, from a brute to a man. And when he sets this up, he sets himself up as a man in opposition to a brute, that is the animalistic depictions of black men, or a boy. And you can see that opposition to that kind of infantilization in the way that he established his economic, political, and intellectual independence from the Garrisonians in Boston. Incidentally, he did that with the help of a woman, Julia Griffith, and that became a very thorny story. During the Civil War and Reconstruction years, you see his rhetoric become explicitly masculine. Men of color to arms formed the basis of citizenship that required the right to vote. He and other black men emerged from black communities in order to lead those communities, portraying themselves as representative of all African Americans. And this was very important at the time, but it also chafed black women, especially a later generation of rising black women leaders such as Anna Julia Cooper and Mary Church Terrell. And those two women were part of a group of black women who worked with his second wife, Helen Douglass, who was his widow, in preserving his books, his papers, and his home so that we now have the research or the materials with which to research him today. This is part of the reason why he can still stand tall as one of the most recognizable and easy to research black abolitionists. But anyway, back to Douglass. Douglass's ideas about womanhood, on the other hand, have yet to be fully explored. The dominant ideology of his time, true womanhood, consisted of a loose mix and match of attributes that are broadly classified, this was early stage of women's history or historiography, broadly classified as piety, purity, domesticity, submission, the angel in the house that Virginia Woolf chafed against, and that you tend to see in, say, Charles Dickens's heroines. Now, the enslaved women among whom Douglass grew up had been barred from all but the submissive elements of this construction, which by extension, of course, tainted the free black women. And the true woman was implicitly also a lily white woman. Come on in, come on. Okay. I don't want to exclude anyone. The activist women among whom he worked, both black and white, took bits of that true womanhood and armored themselves with the piety and purity, submitting themselves only to God in their anti-slavery work. Okay? As for domesticity, most women knew that household labor was going to be their lot. It was just an inescapable fact of life from basically age 9 on, especially once they got married. So, and then this is partly due to the separate spheres construction, division of labor, home versus away. So those white or those middle-class women, the prescriptive literature gave to them the romanticization of the cult of domesticity. But the drudgery of that work, and if you've ever had to gone to like a living history museum or tried to cook over an open fire, done any of that work, you realize that, oh my God, that is heavy labor sometimes, especially the laundering. But that's a whole other story. Okay. The drudgery of that domestic work was left to the immigrant, free black, and enslaved women who worked as domestics without being part of the cult of domesticity. So, in other words, domesticity held different meanings for someone like Anna Douglass, Douglass's first wife, who spent her early years in other women's homes, tending other women's children, and saw domesticity as something aspirational. It would grant her some of that true womanhood. Whereas someone like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she was mistress of her own house, in her own house, over her own children. And she saw domesticity as something from which she needed to be liberated. Okay. So this puts some of these women at cross purposes. So how did Douglass see all of this and incorporate this into his ideals as he navigated gender and the politics of women's rights, for instance? Okay. Certainly most people, scholars and otherwise, know him as a self-proclaimed woman's rights man. And as a black woman's rights man, he proved to be rather politically useful to the women's suffrage movement when they tried to distance themselves from some of their Reconstruction era low points. Shall we just be nice about saying it? In general, he did actually genuinely believe in the equality of men and women, grounded in natural rights arguments and in opposition to contemporary ideas that did insist upon women's general inferiority and invisibility in public life. He declared, "We hold women to be justly entitled to all that we claim for man," when he reported on the famous Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. And a few years later, at a more famous Worcester, at least more famous at the time, Worcester Convention in 1851, he insisted that we advocate for women's rights not because she is an angel, but because she is a woman, having the same wants and being exposed to the same evils as men. And in 1870, when he threw himself in with the nascent women's suffrage movement, he wrote that, "So far as respects its relations to woman, our government is in its essence a simple usurpation, a government of force and not of reason." Like African Americans, he argued, women were rational, contributing, tax-paying members of society who deserved equal rights as American citizens. But his solutions to end women's inequality seem to be the same: integration. in a seemingly impromptu speech he made in an 1858 National Women's Rights Convention in New York City. He said, "A woman could do anything a man can do, and by doing so, assimilate herself to man." Ponder that for a minute. In other words, if women just did what men did, they would become equal to men. So let's just let them do it. Okay? And Douglass's deeds to help women do so followed suit. He and a small but very important cadre of black men insisted upon women's vocal inclusion as speakers and representatives at black men's conventions. And I found that just a fascinating thing to research when I came across it, because I found that him and women's rights movement there's not a lot of there. But when you start to look at him taking women's rights elsewhere, it got a little more interesting. Okay. He not only supported women's equal education and employment, but he participated in such efforts, and he educated his daughter further than his sons. He employed women in his own offices when he could, and he published them in his newspapers. And this is all great. I mean, awesome, yay, fine, except white supremacy is not the same as patriarchy. They just operate in different ways. And whereas Douglass might fare well as an ally for women's equality in a women's history, okay, that can be debated because I've met a lot of historians of women's suffrage movement, and he's not their favorite person. That's a whole other story. In a gender history, he still made patriarchal bargains that hesitated to challenge male superiority, especially African-American male superiority, or address the structural inequalities that women faced as a result of that biological determinism of separate spheres. Take, for instance, a moment in 1869 when the ratification of the 15th Amendment began tearing apart the coalition of the Equal Rights Association. Encountering Susan B. Anthony's opposition to the amendment, he cataloged a list of atrocities committed on African Americans by unreconstructed white Southerners, everything from lynchings to having babies ripped out of our arms and having their brains dashed out on pavements, all very, very true. Okay. But he said that when white women faced the same, then they will have an urgency to obtain the ballot equal to our own, that is, black men. A voice shot back from the audience saying, "Is that not true of black women?" To which he replied, "Not because she is woman, but because she is black." In doing so, he avoided gender-specific outrages such as rape and missed the impossibility of black women separating their gender from their race. Now, he's well aware of the gender-specific abuses. The passages in his autobiography about his Aunt Hester serve as proof. Even his own person served as proof. But he constructed an argument here that relied on a gender norm in which ultimately black manhood protected and defended black womanhood. Okay? Nor did he ever address the divisions of labor at home that might prevent a woman from that assimilation to man, something his daughter struggled every day with in her own marriage, raising lots of children, mostly girls. Now, in the moment, politically speaking, and I must remind everyone here that the activists did not write the 15th Amendment. They had to react to it, and the 15th Amendment was about as the best they were going to do with the most radical Congress they had at that point in history. So just let's make that clear. So this tactic of doing this was pragmatic for the political moment in passing the 15th Amendment. And from the standpoint of women's history, too, researchers into this have shown that black women claimed black men's electoral power as community property, and therefore they gained the same kind of political influence that white women had through white men. Okay? So it's kind of an equality, but okay. Through the lens of gender, however, influence is not direct political power. Black women remain subordinate to black men. If we think about Sojourner Truth, who had for over a decade been declaring her own version of black womanhood that incorporated elements of both true manhood and true womanhood, she had already suggested that black men, just like white men, could be another potential source of black women's suffering and hardship, and that black women might require more direct access to power. And Frances Ellen Watkins Harper pointed out the difficulties facing the disenfranchised single black mother as head of household that needed to be represented. And indeed, this now takes me to the next book that I did not write. Okay. And this was a question that plagued me from the beginning as I wrote this book, and one I think also plagues a lot of people who have a problem with me, a white girl, writing this particular book about a black man and women. And I will say, I don't think they're wrong. Okay. The book that I did write was an integrated history of women. That is, it includes both white and black women. Black women, of course, occupy a significant percentage of the pages, with Douglass's mother, his grandmother, his sisters, Anna Douglass, his daughter Rosetta Douglass Sprague, all of their children, Ida B. Wells even. Okay, but with the exception of Ida B. Wells there at the end, all of these women are within the family sphere. Okay, they're in some way related to him. And you would expect more black women, especially in more public or more professional roles, to be in a book about a black man working for the liberation of black people. I mean, certainly questions about Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Jacobs always crop up in questions and answer sessions, and I hope you ask them. I don't know if I'll have an adequate answer. So the big question is why? I mean, Douglass debated Sojourner Truth, who took him to task for his militancy. She said, "Wer ist Gott, Douglass?" I did that on purpose so you would know she doesn't talk with that Southern accent that everybody likes to throw on her. It was a Dutch accent. I'm into the details. He worked with Harriet Tubman to move people to Canada, and I like to think that she had a lot of really interesting conversations with Anna Douglass, since they were both kind of the same class. And I also like to think that, I wish they put this in the movie, that there were times in impromptu concerts of Douglass playing the violin and his daughter Rosetta playing the piano, and then Harriet Tubman breaking out into song. Idea for screenplay, just throwing that out there. Okay, short story even. Okay. Harriet Jacobs' brother, well, first of all, Harriet Jacobs and Douglass had a mutual friend in Amy Post, one of the most unsung women, unsung greatest people that you should know about in Rochester abolition. And Harriet Jacobs' brother had an office, an anti-slavery office, in the same building as Douglass's North Star. And I like to imagine Douglass and Jacobs sitting down and talking about what Douglass's mother's life was like, since he knew so little of her, and Harriet Jacobs' experiences probably were very similar. But, okay, that would be fiction. Me getting back to the history. So other women, for instance, Douglass brought Louisa Dorsey, who was a very prominent black Philadelphia woman, to Lincoln's inauguration, actually crashed Lincoln's inaugural ball. And he ensured that Mary Ann Shadd, Edmonia Highgate, and other women got hearings at black men's conventions. Fanna and Ella Barrier stayed in his home in Washington, D.C., and he helped them along in their education and civic activism. Okay. So the list goes on. And yet, somehow, I couldn't manage to fit them into my narrative. Okay? Why were none of these women among those who formed him in the same way that, for instance, the British woman Julie Griffiths did? And again, there are a lot of answers. One could just be me, the user, the creator, the white woman who is writing this story and who is identifying with particular women. Another might be in the questions I'm asking. Who are the women who shaped Frederick Douglass? I also see it in the different gendered versions of activism that don't necessarily center Douglass. Because I'm writing a story that still keeps Douglass as the spine of the narrative. Okay. But Douglass wasn't always the focus of everyone's activism. We think of him as the star, but he wasn't the star for everyone. Douglass established himself as the self-made man, proprietor of his own business, head of household, lecturer, writer, leader of African Americans, all firmly within his idea of masculinity. And he didn't expect women to be subordinate to him, and in fact praised and aided women, both black and white, who did the very same things he had. But all of that self-reliance requires a helpmeet. Okay? He did see the separate spheres. He was doing the masculine leading, and there had to be that supporting feminine helpmeet. Two, actually, one in home and one at his office. And it was I put it that way, it's kind of glib, but it was much more complicated and interesting than that. Many abolitionists criticized the one in his office, Julia Griffiths. What they said was that she identified the whole of the anti-slavery movement as being Douglass. That was a critique. But Douglass required somebody like that. He required somebody who could devote their energies to him if the project of his black-run abolitionist newspaper was to survive. And remember, he's coming into this not knowing what the heck he's doing. He needs somebody who can help him do it. Okay, I'm talking about the business of a newspaper. And so she knew how to do it. Furthermore, she was able to mobilize a group of anti-slavery women in Rochester willing to devote a portion of their fundraising activities to supporting that paper. Okay? So she brought the skills, the experience, the contact, the cash needed to make it successful. And leaving all of that aside, her sharp focus on Douglass as the fulcrum of her anti-slavery activism differed significantly from all of these other African-American women's activism. Griffiths operated from a very white woman's perspective. She was, especially since she was foreign, she was British, she operated from a sense of disinterested benevolence. Okay, you could call it a missionary impulse even, but disinterested benevolence. Most African-American women worked together collectively from a sense of self-preservation and of community empowerment. And while African-American women's organizations were among the first to lend support to Douglass, and always did, it's going to be black women who help Helen Douglass preserve the papers in the house and so on and so forth, okay, they just couldn't take him on as a singular cause. They had a lot of other things on their plate. Okay? They took care of communities, and that allowed them to navigate the very dangerous racialized implications of testing the boundaries of that lily white true womanhood, while constructing their own version of a very active black true woman. At the same time, back at home, Douglass's self-reliance as head of household relied on the domestic labor of the head in the household, his wife Anna. And while later generations, including their daughter Rosetta Sprague, attempted to describe Anna in a recognizable abolitionist role, that is, going to meetings, making articles for the fairs, et cetera, Anna saw herself quite differently based on her actions. Okay? She seemed to embrace the domesticity of true womanhood, and in doing so, avoided the civic sphere of anti-slavery organization inhabited by both Julia Griffiths and those African-American women activists. And this differentiated her from such women like that Louisa Dorsey, who was married to Thomas Dorsey, one of Douglass's compatriots, or Carolyn Logan, who was married to Jermaine Logan, who was part of, I'm going to give you a lot of Syracuse references, the Jerry Rescue. So while Douglass might be analogous to Jermaine Logan as a former slave, self-emancipated, marrying up and living in New York, Anna was not analogous to those wives. She came from a very different background. Logan and Dorsey, the Mrs. Logan and Mrs. Dorsey, and they would have called themselves that, grew up in northern, upper socioeconomic strata households. Anna was from the working class in the South surrounded by slavery, and she remained in the working class well into her 30s when the Douglasses became more established in the middle class. To her, remember, domesticity was an aspiration, and her resistance to racism came from that same place too. I hear a little song. Okay. Sorry. Your music goes off, I'm going to dance. I'm from the 80s. Okay, so anyway, where was I? Oh, so Anna Douglass's activism comes from that same place. Okay? Attaining domesticity was a significant blow to racist depictions of dark-skinned, and she was dark-skinned woman like herself. And let us not forget, this was a woman who lived outside the law. She was an outlaw. From the moment she helped Frederick Douglass run away, or Frederick Bailey run away, she broke the law, the fugitive slave laws. She harbored a fugitive from that law until his legal freedom was purchased, incidentally, by women in England. She continued to harbor someone who people in the South wanted to get, and she would have been the one who paid the price in her household with one of their friends who went by the name Harriet Bailey, but also by the name Ruth Cox, also by Mrs. Perry Adams. She helped, all the stories about on the Underground Railroad, she did help in that family endeavor. As one of my students put it, pardon my profanity, she was a little bit of a badass. If you look at it that way. Now, she probably didn't think of herself that way, but that's where her activism comes from. Okay. Now, as Douglass moved out of the gender-integrated world of abolitionism and into the gender-specific masculine world of military recruitment and partisan politics, women became less essential to his professional survival, and thus his relationships to them shifted. I mean, he continued his interest in education, employment, and universal suffrage, which, of course, helped elevate women. But in these arenas, he was not the same type of leader as in abolition as he had been in anti-slavery. And so here you begin to see, well, if you're looking at the story in a different way than the way I constructed it, you will start to see all of these black women here in those same networks, in those same organizations, and new ones. But rather than them supporting him, he looks to they look to him to support them. And he does. Pardon me. He becomes an ally. Okay. So I had asked the question, who are the women who are making Frederick Douglass? And that question now no longer really fits his life. At least not in the way it was earlier. Okay. So, he's helping the women, and you see that especially with Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells comes in and presses Douglass to speak out against lynching. And that was an issue on which he was aware of it, but he kind of ignored it because, well, it was an issue that everybody knew that it was going on. They knew it was going on. They knew it was bad. I mean, a lynching itself is just disgusting. But the propaganda about it was that black men were being lynched because of rape. And that was a subject that a lot of activists, especially black male activists, especially a black male activist married to a white woman at the time, don't want to waste a lot of moral capital on. They have other things they need to worry about that will not be such a thorny area. And she comes in and she tells him, no, that's not the case. Here is the data. And he says, oh. So he supports her. And what you see there is the two of them kind of working together. And I think everybody should know a lot about Ida B. Wells because she's pretty awesome. But that's a whole other talk and a whole other story and a whole bunch of other books. Okay. Which brings me to the last book I didn't write. And this is just a short bit. The last book I didn't write was an intellectual history. What I wrote was a book of deeds. That is, I wrote about people interacting with one another and doing things, not how their ideas were interacting with one another. Okay. like I would say Robert Levine, who's a literary professor, writes about. The way I approach history is I'm trying to rebuild a world. And a lot of that does mean rebuilding the mentality of it. But I'm not looking at what English professors call intertextuality, how texts are in discussion with each other. Douglass's intellectual and development and curiosity runs throughout his biographies, and women always, always, always played a key role in this. After all, Sophia Auld taught him how to read. Okay? She also took it away from him, which then spurred him to want to read more. Julia Griffiths, in all likelihood, supplied some of the early books of his library and continued to do so, and her own background in publishing and literary reviews brought great literature, one of his great loves of life, into his life. Adelia Asing added another layer with German translated, or German language, in translation, German language literature and philosophy. And a lot of broad statements have been made about both Griffiths and Asing and their influence on Douglass's thought, but people are actually much more interested in what they were doing on the other end, if you know what I mean. They never have really delved into a real serious study, a meticulous textual study that requires an examination of their libraries, of their writing, of the emergence of phrases and ideas in Douglass' work that can be traced to theirs, or the reading material they supplied him. And that raises another question. That raises a bigger question, not just with them, but would close textual analysis reveal other instances of women's influence on his ideas or work? Douglass published so many writers, amongst which were women, including black women, and he knew and read so many others. Can their ideas be traced to his own, incorporated, or rejected? And what does that say? So what I offer here in telling you about the books I didn't write is a means of looking at this as a project that continues to go on. Hopefully some of you will write research papers on this. I offer them to you. They are gifts to you. But they're suggestions and hypotheses. They are beginnings rather than ends, and new directions for exploration. Because when you research a book, you see a person, in fact, several persons' life in so many dimensions, like 4 dimensions and 5 dimensions. But when you write the book, you have to marshal it into that single line of a sentence. So much has to fall by the wayside. So many characters don't enter the story, so many ideas. A slight alteration of a choice in the direction of that single line of narrative, that single line of writing, can include other data, other characters, other questions, and yield so many different dimensions to your subject. If you shift the focus from women to gender, then the women who didn't manifest in one will suddenly appear, along with the reasons why they didn't manifest in that one. Change your method from individuals to networks and conversations, and that might demonstrate more influences that have been overlooked. So the books that I did not write, I hope become books that other scholars will write in the future, and that they will, and I did address the limits of my own eyes, they will be coming through other writers' eyes and the things that they pick up. But more importantly, all of these will offer new perspectives on this ever-relevant man, Frederick Douglass, and the world in which he lived, and the world into which it developed, which is the world in which we live. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Yep, thank you, Professor Fought. No mic drops, though, because right now we're going to turn it to questions, and all those questions that come up from Professor Fought's discussion of the books that she didn't write, and fair game, the book that she did write, are in play. The tradition at the Humanities Forum is to open questions with a question from a student. So, what questions come to mind?
I always stun them into silence.
You're not the only one. You're not the only one.
I don't know if it's whether I covered everything or they're like, I can't
It's-
believe she just said that.
Dr. B. I really liked your last little segment on, sort of pondering the books that have yet to be written. And so I was wondering if you, having this framework in which you can analyze sort of, women who aren't really, they don't get their fair share, especially when referring to these big historical figures, would you sort of, I guess, approve or encourage taking that framework that you've created and applying it to other, say, civil rights activists or other people like that? Or would you say that it's just something, it was such a unique relationship with Douglass that it was really only something you could reserve for him?
Okay, so I didn't create it. I wish I did. Okay. I think the first time I countered it was actually Mozart's women. There's been a couple of books on Thomas Jefferson and women. What a head case. I'm sorry, that's on record. What a head case. Okay, so, but no, I absolutely encourage it. Because, what you're talking about when you're talking, your gender, your person, when you walk through life in the body you're in, that affects whatever your race is, whatever your size is, whatever your gender is. This affects so much about your existence, whether you want it to or not. And so when you're talking about Douglass and women, you're talking about him walking through life as a man. Because you're talking about the women around him and what that interaction, that friction between the two produces. And so, yes, absolutely. I think with Douglass, more than a lot of other characters, you have to address women. And that if you don't, you're missing out most of the story. There might be other figures where that's not so much the case, but with him, because of who he was, how he raised, the things he was engaged in. But that doesn't always have to be the case, because what you're doing is you're finding out an essential part about the person. You're finding out this other dimension to this person. It may not be the same thing. In fact, it absolutely won't be the same thing as with Douglass, but it will be something very interesting. Plus, you'll find out a lot of things that people assumed about women in a person's life were not true. Or not that way, anyway.
Questions?
Thank you for thinking I thought of the idea, though.
A lot of the women in Douglass's life were white. That was, at that time, an extremely sensitive matter. Well, I guess, what light do you have to shed on the dynamics between them and him?
On which one? Which women?
The white women in his life and,
Okay.
and Douglass. That,
Okay.
There were, of course, there's appearance. I think you mentioned appearance, but there's also a status thing. There are lots going on in that sort of thing, probably still now, but nowhere near to that degree. Could you shed some light on the situation?
Okay, yeah. Sorry, whoops. Okay, one of the things that frustrated me, and I don't want to call names, but one of the things that frustrated me when I started to write this, well, part of what pushed me to write this book, and or at least pursue the research, and then which led to the book, was that how little the women's work was taken seriously, and because of that prurience, that, the women could not possibly have a role here except, especially the white women, they couldn't possibly have a role here except sexual. They were either groupies or throwing themselves at Douglass, and this didn't sit right with me. And especially as I started to dig into what they were doing there. And it was so I started with Julia Griffiths, and I mention her a lot because she's one of my favorite characters. Again, that's the limits of who you identify with when you're writing, or I identified with. But when you try to read earlier biographies, if they mention Julia Griffiths, they mention her as scandalous, as this woman who's moving into Douglass's household and probably having a sexual affair with him. In the same house as his wife and his small children and his sister and all these other people. And I'm like, come on. But it seems more like we want him to be the big stud. And when I started looking into what Julia Griffiths was doing, and I started to realize all of these skills she brought to the table, that the attacks on, the whole what's she doing there and the sexual scandal is coming out of the Garrisonians who are trying to make Douglass fail so he'll go back to their fold and be their star speaker. It smelled. And when I saw how all of the work she was doing, everything she brought to the table, when I started to research her, and that what she was doing was making his paper successful, giving him the space to be intellectually and politically independent, it made so much more sense. And then I started looking at the way he seemed to, not just with her, but with a lot of other white women, including his second wife, be deliberately provocative. Not prurient, not sexy, but provocative. In the sense that, okay, going all the way down to Ida B. Wells, a black man and a white woman, even today, is a very tricky configuration in public. And he knew it. And so you start to see him, anytime he's in public with a white woman, and he's not subservient to them, he's not their porter, he's not the boy or the brute, he's their equal. He's their companion. He's walking with them. Nothing dirty's going on. People lose their mind. And in dirty pictures are circulated about him. He's in New York, and he's walking with Julia and Eliza Griffiths down Broadway after a meeting, and some street roughs start to beat him up. And one of them goes to the police, and the police, this shouldn't surprise anybody these days, but they go to the police, and the police are like, we don't see anything happening. So this, he knew how provocative it was, and he did it anyway. Because this is a part, and they did it with him. And I found Amy Post saying, specifically, doing that is anti-slavery activism. Because what they're doing is they're challenging that prohibition. That prohibition is about race. It's about the boundary of race, and it's about the stereotypes about black men. And it's about who you can and cannot associate with. So it was very risky, and it was very important that it's clearly above board. It's clearly gentlemanly and lady. It's clearly public. So the whole point is to challenge that racist idea. Like I said, it gives it political import. It's a form of demonstration, much like you could think of a more recent example, well, recent in the 20th century, freedom rides. To black and white integration. Now this adds a gender dimension to it. And later with his second wife, again, they're being married. That was taking it another step further. That kind of stuff got you lynched. That stuff was illegal. And he was able to do it in Washington, D.C. because it was legal at that moment. But this, again, is challenging ideas that black men and white women could love each other. And then he, if you look in his writings at the time, he's skirting on ideas about what is race as a social construction. What is his race? People are losing their minds because I married a white woman, but nobody had a problem with me marrying a black woman. My mother was black, my father was white. Explain this to me. So he's playing with these notions. And so when I started to see this not as something prurient, not as something people are making, but it was a deliberate political action, or it was something that they turned into a political, they understood the political importance of it. And I hope I'm in some way answering your question. So, and I mean, it is a dangerous sort of a thing in many ways, but that's what it was about.
If I can ask the next question, there's a way in which, I see your discussion, the way you're developing it, but the question that you're not developing, which I want you to talk on, is the question of the archive.
Okay.
Right? Like, there's different, the black women who are in those private spaces are going to create a different kind of record than the white women who are involved in editing newspapers. And so I'd like you to reflect on that, too, as a way to think about the differences in the ways you tell the story of the white and black women.
Okay, again, I was being very conservative in my methods. And it did, how do you get at the women who are not creating this kind of records you want? And I can't just, Anna is not creating the kind of records I want. But I can't ignore her, she's there. And the person who actually was helping shape my thinking was reading Hemings of Monticello. And the way that Annette Gordon-Reed had to go about getting at a lot of the Hemingses and getting at Sally. I'm still dealing with that with Sally Hemings now. And so what I had to do with Anna was, first of all, listen. And what does that mean, to listen for her? So I think they call it reading through the documents, is I tried to find every single mention of her. I may not have a lot from her, but anything that mentioned her. And a lot of times these are in private letters. And anywhere she appeared, the one document I didn't get until after it was published, I was like, damn. I mean, it wouldn't have changed anything, but at the same time, I mean, significantly, but it was her when she applied for Freedom Papers, and it was a record of that. That is, her papers to travel about freely to show she was free. And it said she was 5'3". And there was just something about that detail that I just sent shivers up my spine. She was 5'3", and she had a scar on her right hand, and I was like, oh my God. You just have to be there when that happens. So to find things like that, what does that scar mean? What did that scar come from, being 5'3"? What did that mean? What does it look like? What her picture, what does that say? How is she presenting herself in those pictures? The really catty things that Adelita Asing said. I have another word for catty, but you know, I'm trying to keep it clean. And well, okay, what's another way of looking at that? If looking at every time Douglass mentions her, mostly in the letters to Rosetta, and trying to pull together, line up every time she's mentioned, and then look at it differently. You know, I'll look at what the historians have said about her, if they've even bothered, and then look at her. And then try to find, okay, where are other women like her, like Harriet Jacobs? There's Harriet Tubman. How does she differ from them? Where does she fit in a bigger cohort of women like this? Like, what were her prospects as a 20-something-year-old woman, black woman, free in Baltimore in 1838? What was her prospects for her future? So, well, you know, again, this is taking every little bit I could find about her, lining it up, and then looking at that story and saying, okay, what does it tell? Oh, and also Rosetta's memoir of her, which was also clues to finding her in, say, the directories, the census, wherever I could find where she was. And lining it up, what does this mean? And so that's kind of how I approached it, is let's get an outline of her in the documents, and then let's find analogies to her, what's similar and what isn't. And then let's listen to what she's trying to tell us through these documents. And I find a lot of people don't want to listen to her. They want her to be something she isn't. They want her to be literate. They want her to have taught Douglass the violin. They want her to have done this or that. They want her to be something that she wasn't. So what was she? And honor that. And I guess part of what I'm not honoring is by writing about her and talking about her, because that seems to be something she absolutely did not want. Am I in any way answering your question?
Oh, there it is.
Phil and I were reading a book on Douglass together, and I find, I mean, my heart really goes out to Anna. I do. You know, I find it must have been incredibly hard for her to have these women around her. I think there's one occasion where she wanted one of them not to live in their house. I mean, and it seemed like she was very fertile. They were compatible. And he'd be off on a trip. Every time he'd come back, she'd be pregnant right again. You know, they had huge, I don't know how many children they had. Yeah, there is a mystery here, and you're sort of pointing at it, but you're not helping me understand it much. It seems that she probably was proud of her homemaking and her caring for children, and that, you know, that we know. So what is there I'm missing?
Wish I could tell you. That's the thing, is she's always going to have parts about her that are not known. And that's why I always think that her daughter said the best thing about her, which was she could not be known at once. She had to be studied, which is kind of what I was doing. I think I was way too nice to Douglass in relation to her in my book. Because the more I keep thinking about it, I mean, if I were to, because I'm trying to like explain all these other women and what's going on and what I'm writing against, and which is all these other people who haven't treated some of this in a way that I like, and I'm really contrary. I'm really kind of grouchy, so and critical. But but she was a very private person, and I mean, think about this. This is a black woman in the working class. He married up when he married her. He clearly respected her his whole life. They had fight. I think you can see the struggles in their household when it comes to those white women living there. But when they got married, what they're looking at is those first few years when they're in New Bedford. That he's working, she's working, they're having children, they're building a life for themselves in freedom where she might learn how to read, but she'll learn how to read amongst women like herself. He might become a minister. That makes her a lot of standing within the black community there. Their children are going to go to school. I mean, this is going to be so much better of life than they could have ever hoped for in Baltimore. And she's going to be mistress of her own home, raising her own children. And then he goes to that meeting in Nantucket, dang it. Next thing you know, and this is 3 years into their marriage, he goes to a meeting in Nantucket, and next thing you know, their entire life and future has changed. He goes on tour, he's in Boston, he's amongst all these people, and while she can be proud of him, and I think she also said, hey, I remember when you were Freddie, it does shift the power dynamic within their relationship. And it does shift the whole context of their marriage, the whole bargain of their marriage, in ways that I can't even imagine. Because he became famous, he moved in these different, he goes to Europe, for God's sakes, and she's at home with the children, sewing shoes to make sure that they get food on the table. She doesn't know if he's coming back, when he's coming back. Every time he says he's coming back, he says, oh, wait, no, I'm staying longer. So there are things that are happening within that marriage we will never know. Oh, yeah. I just want to make it clear he had a second wife, but he married her after Anna had died. And their granddaughter, Frederica, has a memoir she wrote that's in Howard University, in the Moreland Spingarn collection there. And she writes about remembering the day of her grandmother. She was just a little bitty girl then. And she remembers the day of her grandmother's funeral. And they get to the house, and they're looking for Grandpapa. And so they go running down the hill. They see him down the hill, because Cedar Hill, his home, is up on a hill. And so they go running down the hill. There's Grandpapa, there's Grandpapa. And they sit down, and he's crying. He's in absolute tears. And she says, he keeps repeating over, your grandmama is gone, your grandmama is gone. You have no grandmama anymore. And he's crying. And I'm reading this, and this is a man who is bereft at the loss of his wife. And he writes to his friend, he said, Henry Wagner, Jermaine Logan's daughter, Sarah Fraser Logan, and Sarah Logan Fraser. And she was one of the first black female doctors in the United States, one of the first ones to graduate from SU Medical School. And he says, the post in the center of my house is gone. So there was this thing they had. I'm not answering your question at all, and I don't know if it can be answered, at least not by me.
Before we thank Professor Fought again, I want to remind you that there's a reception in the great room afterwards. I hope you guys will come and join us with some food to discuss this such an interesting talk and such an interesting story. All right, let's thank Professor Fought again.